Hey listeners, we're nearing the end of our 15th anniversary fundraising campaign, and we need your help to meet our goal. This campaign offers you a chance to win a unique food and music experience in one of the most exciting cities in America. Here's how it works. Donate to HRN and you'll be entered to win dinner for two and 2 tickets to a concert in one of 8 amazing cities: New York, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Nashville, Las Vegas, Charleston, Ardmore, Pennsylvania, and Asheville. All donations support our work educating food system storytellers. And when you donate, you can choose one of those cities and you'll be entered to win dinner and 2 tickets to a show. So help us reach our goal and enter to win dinner and a show in the city of your choice. Check out heritageradionetwork.org/15 to donate and enter to win today. That's heritageradionetwork.org/15. Thank you.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network. Since 2009, HRN podcasts have been exploring the wide world of food, beverage, and agriculture. Learn more at heritageradionetwork.org.
This episode is brought to you by Wisconsin Cheese. We do more varieties and flavors of cheese than anywhere else on Earth. By pushing the boundaries of what cheese can and should be, find your next favorite cheese at wisconsincheese.com.
This is Gastronomica, an HRN podcast. I'm your host for today, Jacqueline Orwell. This series is produced in collaboration with Gastronomica, the Journal for Food Studies. Our spring season begins with Gastronomica's newest issue, 23.4, now available online, and features conversations on food memory, community, equity, sweetness, and power. My guest this week is Lillian Say, joining us to discuss her work on confectionery in the Japanese Empire, which appears in a special section on the power of Japanese sweets and sweeteners in our winter issue. Thank you, Lillian, for joining us, and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jackie. It's so honored to be here.
So why don't we begin, if you can briefly share with listeners, first of all, where you're based, where you're calling in from, and also what you do.
Yeah, so I'm actually calling from Taipei, Taiwan. I am a student at Brown University, and my research project is on the history of sugar and confectionery goods in the Japanese Empire. I just finished my research in Japan, which lasted over 1 year and a few months, and I returned to my hometown, Taiwan, and I'm now a visiting student at the Institute of Modern History, Academia Sinica in Taipei.
And so you had mentioned that you're based in history. What other fields do you situate your work in? And what does your work look at? What are you working on these days?
Yeah, so I think I identify with multiple fields. Mostly, I will call myself a historian of the Japanese Empire, but also more broadly, history of commodities and business history, and a little bit more recently, history of science and technology. But besides history, I'm also open interdisciplinary wise, food studies and gender studies. So yeah, I've been recently writing, wrapping up my dissertation, and writing something about technology and food and confectionery goods.
Oh, congratulations! And I have some follow-up questions about that later on. But for the moment, before we dig into the article we're here to discuss today, the Empire's Sweet Tooth, can you set the stage for some of the context, especially the historical context, and share with our listeners where and when this particular story unfolds?
So this story mainly took place in pre-war Taiwan and Japan. The brief background was Japan modernized, kind of became an empire since late 19th century, and Taiwan was Japan's first colony, after the first Sino-Japanese War. And so since 1895 to 1945, Japan ruled Taiwan as a colony for over 50 years. And so there has been a lot of contested discussions about the colonial legacies of Japan and Taiwan, and mostly including economic and infrastructural results of the colonialism. And so there were mainly three, just like very, very vaguely, there were many industries involved, but like the most major products were respectively sugar, camphor, and rice. And so there has been a lot written about sugar and colonialism in Taiwan. And in this article, I kind of step on that, but also want to go a bit further because there has been so much written about sugar and colonialism. But I'm always curious, like, what happened to those sugars? So I focus a bit further on, like, their byproducts, like Western-style confectionery. And so this article is basically discussing how, like, confectionery industry has anything to do with Japan's colonization of Taiwan. And in the article, I focus mainly on two case studies. The first one is Nitaka Confectionery. So this company no longer exists, but it was founded by a Japanese businessman or like a settler or an immigrant from Japan to Taiwan, Taipei. And there he founded his own confectionery companies, and they sold their goods from Taiwan back to Japan, even to Manchuria or like Korea. And so I thought that was a very interesting case. And the second case is a more well-known company, Molinaga Confectionery, that is still very active today. But in the article, I tell a story that is lesser known to the public, is how they were involved with planting cocoa in Taitung in Taiwan, like East Coast Taiwan in 1930s. And this was the result of their collaboration with the Japanese colonial government in Taiwan, where they were dislocating the indigenous people there and in order to get their land to plant cocoa. And I think most people will be surprised. I'm also surprised when I learned the fact that right now the village there in Taitung is still named after Molinaga. In Chinese, it's called like Senyong Cun, namely Molinaga Village. Yeah, so I think basically that's what the article is about.
How did you get there? How did you find this story? I guess, did you start at the history of confectionery and sugar and sweetness, or was it something else that led you there?
Yeah, so my interest in Japan actually began from Taiwan. I was raised, this is my home. I was raised in Taiwan, but actually I was not really interested in Taiwanese history until I was an undergraduate. And the reason for that was in my undergraduate years, there were a lot of campus events about Taiwanese history because it has been repressed for a long time in my parents' generation by the nationalist KMT government. So I think what I learned from those campus activism and all those talks was actually Taiwan has some interesting past, and it was not as dark, and it was not as dark as people had thought, but it's a bit more nuanced, more diverse. So I actually want to know more about Japan, how did Japan colonized Taiwan. I think that was my initial interest. So when I was applying for grad school, I really wanted to work on something that covers both Japan and Taiwan. And since I was so interested in food and commodity history, and I realized, there was so much, people know a lot about sugar and a lot about the labor condition. It was very exploitative, and also about the larger structure, but we rarely talk about what happened after those sugar and how they actually affected people's lives. If, for example, if sugar was a commodity of empire, then where and when did this empire end, or did it even end? So I think that was my initial motive, and I also want to use sugar as something very universal to write Taiwan into the historiography of the Japanese Empire.
And so the piece strikes to the heart of questions about empire and nation building and modernity, and the role that food commodities and their consumption plays in what you call the civility and the civilizing process. And so the theme of equity or inequity is central to histories of sugar production. And so listeners may be familiar with the work of Sidney Mintz, whom you cite, on Sweetness and Power, the place of sugar in modern history. And in the article, you also mention the work of Yanai Taudo, who made the argument that Japan's sugar industry was, you quote, deeply intertwined with unequal global order, end quote. So can you share more about this work and how these two scholars the work of these two scholars informed your own?
Yeah, so Yanai Tadao, he was an economist, Japanese economist, and he wrote he was very, very critical of the Japanese government, which was a little bit rare at the time, but also very courageous to a certain extent. And so he wrote a book called Taiwan Under Japan's Imperialism, and in this book he termed this he coined this term called like sugar imperialism. And it's interesting because like he wrote this book in 1929, and like his vision at the time was already pretty global. So he was basically aware of the close, or he was already aware of the close connection between sugar and industry and colonialism at the time, and not just in East Asia, but he knew about like what was happening in the Americas and like all those sugar beets like development in Europe, and how like all of them like were integrated to this like global capitalism. So he was situating Taiwan's sugar industry under Japanese colonialism in that context, and his focus is more on the labor exploitation, how like even though like Japanese official histories will say, oh, we modernized like the sugar industry in Taiwan, but he was saying like there was like a lot of exploitation, and like some like how that contributes to like the class differences, and how this whole gap of economic class was what actually made the colonialism last long. So I think he was writing, compared to Mintz, he was writing more from the perspective of global capitalism and labor, and rather than slavery. And for Mintz, of course, I also really inspired by his work. So he wrote about how sugar was added to coffee, chocolate, and tea, and how that affected people's lives. But when I was reading it, I was also very curious because the dietary habits in East Asia was pretty different compared to Europeans. And so I was curious what will happen if we bring this sweetness and power model to the Japanese empire, to an East Asian empire. Also, before I started grad school, I was working in a Japanese company, so I was also interested in some like other actors in this story, because like for Yanai Hara and Cindy Mintz, like their works are mostly focusing more on like more structural and more macro perspective, and so I also want to add different actors into the story.
So a question about those different stakeholders then. When you set out to do this research, I guess I have a big question, which is, what did you look at and what historical sources help tell that story? And I guess my more specific question is thinking about business history. And it's often very challenging for historians sometimes, in some cases, to get access to those histories. So how did you piece together the history of these two companies? Do they have dedicated archives?
Yeah, so I started this project during the pandemic, so I couldn't go to Japan, but I was very lucky because I could do research in Taiwan. But also this is the first chapter I wrote, so I basically started with the most basic ones. So it's like the newspaper databases. So you can imagine this is like just browsing New York Times or Washington Post like 100 years ago. And I think it basically took me 3 months or maybe more just transcribing almost every newspaper entry relevant to this project. Like I use some keywords like sugar, confectionery, and also the companies I'm studying. And it was difficult, but also very rewarding. Of course, I basically probably used only 10% of those, newspaper entries. I transcribed it, but they were really helpful to situate myself, to know the background of the story and who the actors were involved and look from there. So after that, I was very lucky because most pre-war primary sources in Taiwan were digitized. So I tried to diversify my sources to look at diaries. There was a great diary and database, legal records, some travelogues, advertisements, and some corporate publications that were open to the public. And I also really benefit a lot from previous studies, and mostly in Taiwan and some public writings in Japan. So a lot has been written about these two companies, but not in English, and like mostly not in an academic setting. So I'm trying to I start from there, and then I discover some new sources myself, and then try to situate them in a larger framework. And also I was very lucky. I have friends that help me a lot. For this article, Moninaga's involvement with the cocoa industry has a lot to do with the indigenous population, and indigenous history is something I'm not familiar with, but I was very lucky. I have a friend at UCL. She's now at UCL, and she was at the time working on a governmental project relevant to this whole story, so she also helped me a lot.
And you mentioned in the article, I mean, there are images in the article. Listeners can access the article through the show notes. There are images in the article containing some ads and advertisements, and that obviously played a role in your sources as well. Can you describe some of the ads? Were there any ads that are particularly powerful or memorable for this particular story?
Yeah, so I think there were many interesting ads, and I think I included one in the article that was Nitaka Confectionery's product called camels. You can see a woman, kind of like a movie star, and then you can see all those small candy boxes called literally camel in Japanese. And I think this visual inclusion of camels in the story was really inspiring me. I was curious, so I was thinking really into what the camels mean to pre-modern Japan, and found all those interesting connections. And also something more recently, I think I included a picture of Nitaka's banana caramel in the article. But after this, I had the chance to see a real box in another archive, and I realized that on the other side of the box there was actually a picture of the factory in Taiwan. So I was like, oh, that was something interesting. The factory itself became part of the advertisement. Yeah.
I have more questions about the banana caramels, but we're going to take a short break, and we will be back in just a moment.
This episode is brought to you by Wisconsin Cheese. There's a reason when you think of Wisconsin, you think cheese. Cheese is a huge part of Wisconsin's history and future. In Wisconsin, the state of cheese, the tradition of cheese-making excellence began 180 years ago, before Wisconsin was recognized as a state. Immigrants traveled to settle in this lush green hills of Wisconsin, bringing their cheese-making traditions with them. These storied skills, combined with the freshest milk available, created a cheese-making culture that is uniquely Wisconsin. Wisconsin's 1,200 cheesemakers, many of whom are third and fourth generation, continue to pass on old-world traditions while adopting modern innovations in cheese-making craftsmanship. Find your next favorite cheese at wisconsincheese.com.
And we're back. This is Gastronomica on HRN. I'm Jacqueline Roel, talking with Lillian Say about her latest article, The Empire Sweet Tooth, the Making of Western-Style Confectionery in Colonial Taiwan, now available in Gastronomica 23.4. Lillian, I have a question about those banana caramels. I have lots of questions about the banana caramels, but first, before we talk about some of the materiality of these commodities that you're studying, I just wanted to circle back on question about kind of the research and the archival process. Were there any challenges or surprises that you encountered when you were doing the research for this article? And how did it shape your experience?
Yeah, so for these two companies specifically, so Nitaka Confectionery, they no longer existed. So of course, there was no archive of theirs. But what I did was I tried to find as many things as I could, and there were a lot of some unexpected stuff. So for example, I found stories about this person in or the people in this company in business magazines in Taiwan, and then there were a few articles, and I tried to picture what exactly happened, and that was something ended up in the article of they had a fight with the sugar industry, and they were the confectionery makers. They had a huge fight with that. So I think it was I think of course there were difficulties in studying a company no longer existed, because I had so many questions. I really wanted to know how they were involved with the government, but since I could not get a straightforward answer to that, I tried to use whatever I can. For example, I luckily found a book about how a lot of Japanese, mostly Japanese people in Taiwan, they were contributing their calligraphy to the military government and donated funds for military purposes, and this company was also part of them. So I was trying to, of course I can't go beyond my evidence, but that I think what I did was to show there were some connections there, and we can leave and we can start things from there. And for Morinaga, it's a huge company, and they have published many of their archival sources, and that was very, very helpful. But I also had a huge challenge because when I finally got into Japan, I tried to get access to their corporate archive, and I was rejected, which was which was very common. But I think I was very fortunate because I was looking at the existing scholarship, mostly not in English, and a lot of those Japanese articles, they mentioned, they got a lot of sources from this prefectural archive, which is you cannot find anything online. So I wrote to this library, and it turns out they had 20 boxes of primary sources that's hugely relevant to this study, and so that was very, very lucky. And also, again, I cannot emphasize how lucky I am to have many friends. So I luckily had a friend who was a Japanese person, but he's also an independent scholar. He's always in some kind of archive, some kind of old bookstore shop, and he always just sent me anything relevant. So I also made a lot of those kind of friends on Twitter, and also sometimes find some unexpected sources on Twitter, not citing Twitter, of course, but there were many anonymous collectors that would share what they find, and if I'm interested in something, I would contact them and get something from them. Yeah,
there's kind of an ephemerality to what you're studying, in a sense, right? There's a question of the preservation of the sources and the access to the sources, and then there's also the material items themselves, the commodities themselves. So the banana caramels, first I'm wondering, can you describe what the banana caramels were? Because it seems that they're no longer available. So I guess my next question is, what's it like to study the sweetness of food that can no longer be accessed? And are there any products like them on the market right now?
So I think banana caramel I had not tasted by myself, but I think it is just more likely an addition of flavor to the original caramel. And of course, I think there might be still, you can find something similar on the market now, but it's totally different, produced in different production line using different materials. But of course, the original taste was indeed lost. There is a methodology to solve this problem called making and knowing. I think it was proposed by a professor from Columbia University, and I luckily had a chance to take a class based on this method at Brown University and taught by Howard Cook and Tara Nomadal, and it was a fascinating experience. Basically, we just tried to find all those old recipes and try to remake whatever we have. I think that's a very, very cool idea and very, very cool methodology. But when I was working on my research, I realized, it's actually a bit challenging because most of the food I'm studying, they were not handmade, but produced in industrialized factories. So it would be a bit more difficult for me to rebuild all the factory and try to see how they made it. So I think what I did was of course, it would be great if I can adopt a more anthropological method to to this history of sweetness. But what I did was like, I think I'm more interested in the social aspects of sweetness, like how people talked about it and how people thought about how to make this taste. And sometimes it's not just about the taste, but about the color, about the smell, and about how it was packaged. So I think these are like equally interesting aspects, like compared to how they actually taste. I mean, it's more like a complementary like way to solve this issue.
Of course. And sweetness is, I mean, as your article shows, and I think as the section shows, always socially and culturally produced, right? There's a lot at play. What were some of the other candies that you came across? Cocoa was a big one. What form did those products take? What did they look like?
Besides banana caramels, there were also like other types of flavor, like fruits flavor added to like caramels and chocolate. And also there were like a lot of, actually I think it's interesting because like there are so many names, like product names added to those goods. Like I'm sometimes not really sure what they were. Like there was I think it was a caramel named like manna, like it's like, I think it's a Christian thing. So yeah, I think there were like actually there were like a lot of different types of confectionery out there. Also like biscuits was considered as like confectionery goods at the time, and yeah, like different kind of flavor was added to it. Also like mints as well.
And all of these Western style confectioneries, they were produced within factories, as you mentioned. And technological advancement played a really big role in the expansion of the commercial network and the development of this particular industry at this time. So can you give us an example of any new technologies that were really important to creating these confectionery products? And what might it have been like to have been in a factory?
Yeah, so this is actually what I'm writing now. This is one of my chapters and my last chapter I'm working on. So it's about the factory and this whole manufacturing process. So I think from a retrospective perspective, the confectionery factory was really like very high tech. I mean, at the standard at the time, because like there were so many discussions about how the entrepreneurs, the people in the company, they were so excited about getting the best and the latest like mechanics, mostly from Western countries, and how they have this very standardized process of like what to add first and then what to do next, and then like different kinds of like very professional terms about how like grinding and like conching like the cooked chocolate and things like that. And also, I think what really fascinated me was like, as I think I mentioned earlier, like there were like a lot of usage of like color dyes and like fragrance, and those were like new technology at the time. But also what came along with them was like a lot of like panic about consuming these things to your body, because there were like a lot of incidents of like food poisoning from like adding the wrong dyes and like fragrances. I think this was really, I was really inspired by Ai Hisano's book, Visualizing Taste, like how like taste was not really just about like taste, but also like visual and olfactory like sensory experiences. And also like another important factor in the factory was packaging, like how I think there has been a lot of great works about how this so-called like package pleasure was like important, like how the package was important for consumers to imagine a product and a brand. So all these together were like very, very interesting cases like in the factory, and they also were really, really careful and about the hygiene of the environment. Like they want to let their consumers know like these products were made in a very safe and hygienic like place, and so people wouldn't need to worry about like any concerns after eating their products. And so what I find interesting was like there were actually a lot of already at the time there were a lot of representations and depictions of the factory to the public, so it was never just a place for production.
How are they shared with the public, these depictions?
There was, for example, there was like manga, like comic, like Morinaga, the second company in the story. They were very, very rich, and they had this comic book for children, and in that book they would always have all those like very illustrated like a manual of like how like caramels were made, how chocolate were made, and also like there were videos, PR videos shared with the public about like just not, I think some were really with explanations like, oh, this was the only high-tech machine in East Asia, and like we had this to make this candy, and there were also some just showing you how this high-tech machines were working and how all those mostly female laborers were like wearing white uniforms were working there. But of course, I think this is just one side, like very selective, and actually I believe the factories were also not a very good place to work at. I think I mentioned in my other article, like there was like a proletariat writer who wrote a story about female workers in the caramel company, and it was a very like high pressure, and also like the salary was very low. So I do believe that this kind of labor conditions was really hard at the time, which was very, very different from what the companies were trying to portray.
Thanks, Lillian. So you mentioned that you're continuing your writing on this topic, and you also mentioned another article. So I just wanted to share with readers of Gastronomica, they can access this article, The Empire Sweet Tooth, online through our website. But your other article, if they want to read more about your work, came out this fall in Gender and History. Is that right?
I think it was last fall, or 2022, I think.
2022, my apologies, 2022 in Gender and History, where you expand on the story. So before we wrap up, Lillian, is there anything more you'd like to share with listeners?
Oh, I just think it's a great honor to publish with Gastronomica and be on your podcast, and I'm very excited to finish this project, which should be within less than a year, and I have some I think I will continue to work on food and history in the future, and I'll be interested to keep in touch.
Absolutely. Thanks, Lillian. And I look forward to reading your work when it comes out. So thank you for joining us, Lillian. Listeners will be able to read the full piece in Gastronomica, the Journal for Food Studies, issue 23.4, now available online. For more details, visit gastronomica.org. We'll return in a couple weeks with more later in March from our next issue, 24.1, out soon. Subscribe to the Gastronomica podcast feed on your favorite platform to stay updated on our newest episodes.
This show is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org/subscribe.